The heavy scent of metallic blood and expensive cologne filled the confined space of the underground garage. Kenji didn't look at the men holding the silenced pistols. He looked only at the polished toes of his own Italian leather shoes. A heavy blow landed against his ribs, forcing a jagged breath from his lungs. He collapsed onto the cold concrete, the grit scraping against his cheek. Above him, the syndicate leader, a man whose name made entire cities tremble, spat on the floor. The spit landed an inch from Kenji's eye. "You were a mistake," the man's voice grated like stones in a blender. "A stray dog I fed out of pity. You're worthless, Kenji. Get out of my sight before I decide a bullet is cheaper than your severance pay." Kenji didn't beg. He didn't even flinch. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming, and walked toward the exit without looking back. He left the shadows of the empire he had helped build, leaving behind the only life he knew. But as the heavy steel doors groaned shut behind him, the bruised corners of his mouth twitched into a silhouette of a smile. The world thought they knew who was walking away. They had no idea who was actually coming back. 24 hours ago, I was the ghost of the Onishi Syndicate. The fixer, the shadow, the man who cleaned the messes the boss didn't want to touch. I had spent 3 years playing the role of the loyal, quiet subordinate, enduring the insults and the backhanded blows. I gave them my sweat, my blood, and my silence. Everyone believed I was a nobody from the streets of Osaka. That was the lie I sold them. The truth was buried under layers of encrypted files and a past I had spent a decade erasing. I wasn't a stray dog. I was the architect of a rival dynasty, and the Onishi Syndicate had just handed me the keys to their own destruction by letting me walk out that door alive. The rain turned the neon lights of Shinjuku into bleeding smears of red and blue against the asphalt. Kenji stepped into a cramped phone booth, the glass rattling with every passing truck. His fingers, steady despite the swelling in his knuckles, dialed a number that didn't exist in any directory. The line hissed with static for 3 seconds before a voice, cold and precise, answered. "The eagle has left the nest," Kenji said. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Is the asset secure?" the voice asked. Kenji reached into his pocket and pulled out a microdrive no larger than a fingernail. He felt the sharp edges press into his thumb. "I have the ledgers. Every bribe, every shipment, every name in the Tokyo Police Department. Tell the board I'm coming in." He hung up and stepped back into the rain. The man who had been called worthless was now the most dangerous person in Japan. He arrived at a nondescript dry cleaners in the Minato ward. The bell chimed as he entered, the steam from the presses smelling of starch and lilies. An elderly man behind the counter didn't look up from his ledger. "We don't have any suits for you," the man muttered. Kenji leaned over the counter, his shadow falling across the paper. "Check the back for the Kuroda inheritance." The old man froze. He looked up, his eyes scanning Kenji's battered face, finally resting on a small obsidian ring on Kenji's pinky finger, a ring that hadn't been there an hour ago. The old man bowed so low his forehead touched the wood. He led Kenji through a heavy curtain into a room filled with monitors, tactical gear, and 3 men in charcoal suits who stood at attention the moment he entered. "Sir," one of them said, stepping forward with a medical kit. "The chairman is waiting for your report." Kenji waved the medic away. "The chairman can wait. First, I want the Onishi accounts drained. Every yen. By dawn, I want that man to realize that the worthless dog took the leash with him." By 3 a.m. the first tremors hit the Onishi Syndicate. In his penthouse, the boss, the man who had discarded Kenji, stared at a tablet screen that flickered with red warnings. His offshore accounts in the Caymans were hemorrhaging. 10 million. 50 million. 100 million. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk, sending a crystal glass of whiskey shattering against the wall. "Call the bank," he roared at his terrified assistant. "Find out who is doing this." The assistant's hands shook so violently the tablet nearly slipped. "Sir, it's not a hack. The transfers are being authorized with your own private keys. Only you and Kenji had those." The boss's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "Kenji is a cockroach. He doesn't have the brains for this. Find him. Bring him to me in pieces." But the phone started ringing, not just his, but every captain in his organization. The police were at the docks. The police were at the warehouses. The worthless fixer hadn't just left. He had mapped the exit routes and left the doors wide open for the law. Kenji sat in the back of a black sedan, watching the flashing blue lights in the distance. His phone vibrated. A text from an unknown sender. "He's at the docks. He thinks he can escape on the freighter." Kenji looked at the driver. "Change of plans. Let's go say goodbye to my former employer." The car accelerated, the engine a low growl through the city streets. Kenji checked the chamber of his pistol. He didn't feel the weight of the gun. He felt the weight of the 3 years he'd spent in the dirt. If you think Kenji's patience was the ultimate weapon against a man who thought he was a god, hit the like button so this story reaches the ones who are tired of being underestimated. The docks were a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and the smell of salt and diesel. The boss was there, surrounded by his last 4 loyal bodyguards, scrambling toward a waiting boat. He looked frantic, his expensive suit stained with sweat and rain. He tripped over a coil of rope, falling to his knees, the same position he had forced Kenji into only hours before. A pair of headlights cut through the fog, pinning him like an insect. The sedan door opened. Kenji stepped out, but he wasn't the bruised, limping man from the garage. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than the boss's car, and his posture was that of a king returning to his throne. The bodyguards raised their weapons, but they hesitated. They saw the black sedan, the obsidian ring, and the cold, absolute certainty in Kenji's eyes. "I told you to get out of my sight," the boss screamed, his voice cracking. "I told you you were nothing." Kenji walked closer, stopping just outside the range of the guards. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, playing a recording. It was the boss's voice from 2 years ago, detailing the murder of a rival's daughter, a crime the Syndicate had blamed on an outsider. "You called me worthless," Kenji said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "But a man is only as valuable as the secrets he keeps. And I've kept all of yours." He looked at the guards. "Drop the guns and you live to see the sun. Stay with him and you go down with the ship." The guards looked at each other, then at the man on his knees, and then they did something that made the boss's heart stop. They stepped aside. The boss scrambled backward, his heels digging into the wet wood of the pier. "Who are you?" he hissed, the terror finally breaking through his pride. "You're not Kenji. You're a nobody." Kenji knelt down, bringing his face inches from the man who had tormented him. He whispered a name that hadn't been spoken in the underworld for a decade, the name of the family the Onishis thought they had wiped out in a fire years ago. The boss's eyes went wide, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of realization. He reached for a hidden ankle holster, a desperate, final gamble. But Kenji was faster. He didn't fire a gun. He simply showed the man the screen of his phone. It was a live feed of the boss's daughter, sitting in a cafe, completely unaware that 2 of Kenji's men were sitting at the table next to her. The boss's hand froze midair. "You won't hurt her," the boss pleaded, the arrogance completely evaporated. "She has nothing to do with this." Kenji stood up, looking down at the broken shell of a man. "That's the difference between us. I don't kill children to win wars. I just make sure the fathers remember exactly what they've lost." He turned his back on the boss, walking toward his car as the sirens grew louder, converging on the docks from every direction. The boss tried to stand, to run, to do anything, but he was paralyzed by the sheer scale of the collapse. Everything he had built, every life he had taken, had led to this moment, being outplayed by the man he thought was beneath his boot. In the quiet of the car, Kenji watched the sunrise begin to bleed over the Tokyo skyline. The microdrive was gone, delivered to the one prosecutor in the city who couldn't be bought. The Onishi Syndicate was a ghost story now. His phone chirped. A message from his sister, the one he had protected from the shadows for 3 long years. "Is it over?" Kenji typed 2 words and felt a pressure in his chest finally release. "I'm home." He looked out the window at the waking city, knowing that tomorrow the news would be filled with the fall of an empire. But they would never know the name of the man who pulled the thread. If you believe the quietest person in the room is often the one you should fear the most, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story matters. The car pulled up to a modest house on the outskirts of the city. A woman stood on the porch, clutching a sweater around her shoulders against the morning chill. Kenji stepped out, his movements slow, the adrenaline finally fading to leave a hollow ache in its place. He walked up the path, his eyes never leaving hers. She didn't see a mafia fixer or a rival heir. She just saw her brother. But as they embraced, a dark sedan with tinted windows pulled up at the end of the street. It sat there for a moment, the engine idling before slowly rolling away. Kenji watched it go, his jaw tightening. The Onishis were gone, but in this world, there was always another shadow waiting for its turn. He held his sister tighter, his eyes turning back into the cold flint that had survived the Syndicate. The war wasn't over. It had just changed shapes. He walked inside and closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet morning. On the kitchen table sat a single, unmarked envelope that hadn't been there when his sister went to sleep. Kenji felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He opened it slowly. Inside was no letter, no threat, and no money. There was only a single charred photograph of a house he recognized from his childhood, the one that had burned down 20 years ago. And on the back, written in a hand he thought was buried in a grave, were 4 words: "You missed a spot." Kenji dropped the photo, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at his sister, who was smiling as she poured coffee, completely unaware that the nightmare hadn't ended. It was only just beginning. He snatched the photograph off the table, the edges sharp enough to slice his thumb. He walked to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. The street was empty now, the black sedan gone, but the feeling of being watched clung to the air like humidity. He turned back to the kitchen, his mind racing through the archives of his memory. That handwriting, slanted, aggressive, the cross on the T jagged like a lightning bolt. It belonged to Hiroshi, his father's old right-hand man. The man who had supposedly died in the fire that claimed the rest of his family. If Hiroshi was alive, the entire foundation of Kenji's revenge was built on a foundation of sand. Kenji? His sister's voice broke the silence, soft and curious. "You've been staring at that wall for 5 minutes? Is everything okay?" He turned, folding the photo and slipping it into his pocket, his movements practiced and calm. "Just work, Hannah. The firm I work for, there's some unfinished business." She frowned, stepping closer, but she didn't press. She had learned long ago that the shadows he carried weren't meant for her to share. "You're home now," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "That's all that matters." Her warmth was a foreign sensation, a reminder of the life he had sacrificed. He wanted to tell her, to warn her, but the words died in his throat. Protecting her meant keeping her in the dark. The phone in his pocket buzzed, a sharp vibration that jolted his spine. He excused himself and slipped into the hallway, answering on the first ring. It was his contact at the dry cleaners. "We have a problem," the old man said, his voice stripped of its usual stoic rhythm. "I went to the warehouse to secure the remaining files just like you asked. It was empty. Not just empty, swept clean. Not a piece of paper, not a single cigarette butt. And Kenji? There was something carved into the center of the concrete floor." Kenji gripped the phone, his knuckles turning white. "What?" The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your father's crest. The one that was supposed to have vanished when the house burned." Kenji didn't say goodbye. He hung up and moved. He didn't bother with his jacket. He just took his keys and the small, heavy pistol he kept hidden under the floorboards in the closet. He kissed Hannah's forehead as she was setting the table. "I have to go back to the office. Something came up." She smiled, unaware of the lethal precision in his eyes. "Be safe," she called out as he walked out the door. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He drove toward the old estate on the edge of the city, the one that had been a ruin for 2 decades. The weeds grew high, strangling the iron gates that had rusted shut years ago. Kenji didn't use the gate. He scaled the wall, his boots landing silently on the overgrown path. The house was a skeleton of wood and brick, charred timbers standing like jagged teeth against the night sky. He moved through the ruins with his weapon drawn, every sense dialed to an agonizing pitch. The smell of wet ash was still there, a ghost of the past that lingered on the wind. He reached the center of the living room where the floorboards had collapsed into the cellar. There, etched deep into the remaining concrete, was the crest, a dragon coiled around a broken sword. It was fresh. The concrete dust was still loose in the grooves. He knelt, his hand hovering over the symbol, when the sound of a match striking echoed through the hollow house. The flare of a flame illuminated a figure sitting on a stone pillar in the corner. Hiroshi. He looked older, his hair white, his face etched with deep, jagged scars, but the eyes were the same. Cold. Calculating. "You were always the faster one, Kenji," Hiroshi said, the match flame dancing in his reflection. "But you were always too soft to finish the job." Kenji stood, his pistol pointed directly at the old man's chest. "You died in the fire," he said, his voice flat. Hiroshi chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "I died so you could live and build your little empire, so I could watch you grow into the monster I knew you could be. You played the Syndicate perfectly. You took down the Onishis without lifting a finger of your own. You have potential, boy. More than your father ever had." Kenji stepped forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You killed them. You killed my family for power." Hiroshi shook his head slowly, tossing the match into a puddle of gasoline near Kenji's feet. "I killed them because they were weak. I killed them because the world is built on the bones of the soft. And you?" He gestured to the ruins around them. "You've spent your whole life hunting ghosts, and now you're standing in the middle of your own graveyard. You think this is over? You think you won? The gasoline ignited, a wall of flame roaring up between them, turning the room into a furnace. Kenji fired, but Hiroshi was already moving, vanishing into the shadows of the basement. The heat was blinding. Kenji dove for the exit, his lungs burning as he gasped for air. He made it to the porch just as the roof began to buckle inward, the entire structure groaning under the weight of the flames. He fell onto the grass, coughing, his eyes locked on the burning house. He hadn't killed him. He had been played, manipulated into clearing the path for the real architect of the destruction. If you think Kenji's hunt for the truth has only just begun and he deserves justice for his family, leave a like so I know to tell the rest of his story. He stumbled to his car, his clothes smelling of smoke and defeat. He had lost the fight, but he had gained the truth. Hiroshi was out there, and he had been orchestrating everything from the start, using Kenji as a blunt instrument to dismantle his competition. Kenji sat in the driver's seat, his hands trembling, not from the heat, but from the realization that his entire mission, his entire life, had been a pawn's game. He reached for his phone, ready to burn it all down, ready to call in every favor, every asset, every ounce of power he had left. He wouldn't be the shadow anymore. He would be the storm. He drove through the city, the rain starting again, washing away the ash of the estate. He had to get to Hana. If Hiroshi was back, he would be coming for the only piece of the past Kenji actually loved. He pushed the car to its limit, the engine screaming as he tore through the empty streets. He reached the house in record time, skidding into the driveway. The lights were out. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Kenji didn't think. He drew his weapon and sprinted inside. The house was empty. The coffee cup was still on the table, half full, cold. A note was pinned to the wall with a kitchen knife. Kenji walked over, his heart cold. He pulled the knife, the paper fluttering to the ground. Check the cellar, Kenji. I told you, you missed a spot. Kenji ran to the basement door, kicking it open. Down in the darkness he heard a faint, rhythmic sound, the ticking of a clock. He descended the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the dark. There, strapped to a pillar, was his sister. And in front of her, a complex, heavy-duty mechanism. A bomb. The timer was counting down. 3 minutes. Kenji knelt, his hands working with the precision of a master surgeon. He didn't feel fear. He felt a focus so intense it narrowed his entire world down to the red and blue wires. Hiroshi was watching. He had to be. Kenji's hands were steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He cut the blue wire. The ticking stopped. Silence filled the basement, heavy and suffocating. Hana gasped, her eyes flying open as he sliced through her bindings. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. He held her, his gaze scanning the shadows of the basement for any sign of his enemy. He pulled her up the stairs, his mind already calculating the next move. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't keep her safe while he was hunting a ghost. Pack, he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. Everything. We're leaving. She didn't ask questions. She saw the look in his eyes, the same look that had terrified the Onishi Syndicate. They were out of the house in 10 minutes, the car loaded with nothing but the essentials. As they drove away, Kenji watched the rearview mirror. A familiar black sedan pulled out of a side street 3 blocks back. He led them on a chase through the city, dodging through traffic, taking alleyways, burning through red lights. He had to lose him. He had to get Hana to the safe house in the mountains. They traded roads, circled back, and finally, after an hour of high-speed maneuvers, the black sedan was gone. Kenji pulled into the winding mountain road that led to the secret bunker. He was safe for now. But as he looked at the gas gauge, he saw it dropping fast. He had a leak in the tank. He had been sabotaged. He steered the car into a clearing and brought it to a stop. We walk from here, he said, grabbing the bags. They trekked through the woods, the trees closing in around them, the darkness complete. They reached the bunker, a heavy steel door set into the side of the mountain. Kenji punched in the code, the heavy mechanisms grinding. They stepped inside and he bolted it shut. He was safe. But as he turned to check on Hana, he realized the room was cold, too cold. And on the table, in the center of the bunker, sat a single red rose. Kenji's blood turned to ice. This bunker was secure. Only he had the key. Only he knew the location. He turned to Hana, but she wasn't looking at the rose. She was looking at him. Her eyes, usually soft and gentle, were hard. Cold. You really should have been more careful, brother, she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its warmth. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a suppressed pistol. He told me you'd come here. He told me you'd lead him straight to the only place he couldn't reach. Kenji stood paralyzed, the world tilting on its axis. His sister, the one he had protected, the one he had built his entire life around, was working with Hiroshi. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. She walked toward him, the barrel of the gun never wavering. "Because you left us to die in that fire, Kenji. You were the golden boy. You were the one he saved. And you left me to burn." She gestured to the scars on her arm, visible for the first time, burn marks that reached up to her neck. "I've been waiting for you to fix this, Kenji. But you were too busy playing Mafia boss." Kenji felt the weight of his own hubris crushing him. He had been so blind, so obsessed with his own version of the past, that he hadn't seen the monster sitting at his own table. He didn't fight back. He didn't reach for his gun. He just looked at her, his heart shattering. "I'm sorry," he said. And in that moment he meant it more than anything he had ever said. She pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed his shoulder, slamming him back into the wall. He slumped to the floor, the pain a white-hot spike in his side. She stood over him, the gun steady. "This isn't the end, Kenji. This is just the prologue." She turned and walked toward the door, leaving him there in the dark. As the heavy steel door slammed shut, locking from the outside, Kenji reached into his pocket. His hand brushed against a small metal object, the microdrive. He hadn't given it all to the prosecutor. He had kept one copy. A backup. A failsafe. He was bleeding, trapped, and betrayed, but he was alive. And as long as he was alive, the game wasn't over. He dragged himself toward the computer console in the corner. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. He began to type, his fingers slick with blood, his mind clearing. He had one last trick up his sleeve, a digital bomb that would destroy everything Hiroshi and his sister had built. He pressed enter. Upload complete. He leaned his head against the console, his vision blurring. He had set the fire. Now he just had to wait for the world to burn. If you think Kenji's final move will bring them all down and you want to see the fallout of his sacrifice, leave a like so I know to tell the finale of this story. The silence in the bunker was deafening. The only sound was the hum of the cooling fans and the steady rhythmic dripping of blood from his shoulder onto the floor. Kenji sat in the darkness, the glow of the monitor the only light in his world. On the screen a progress bar crept forward. 80%? 85%? 90%? He had uploaded the ledger to every major news outlet, every government agency, and every rival syndicate in the country. By morning, Hiroshi's entire network would be under siege. His sister's betrayal would be exposed, and the foundations of their fragile alliance would crumble. He had sacrificed his own freedom, his own safety, and the only family he had left, all to ensure that the cycle of violence ended tonight. He leaned back, the metal of the console digging into his spine. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the room turning into a hazy, indistinct gray. He wondered if Hannah would understand, or if the hate had consumed her completely. He wondered if the fire had taken more than just her skin, if it had charred her heart, turning it into the same kind of flint that resided in his own. He closed his eyes, listening to the silence of the mountain, waiting for the end. He hadn't planned on walking out of here alive, not once the reveal happened. He had come here to finish it. Hours passed. The bunker was a tomb, cold and silent. Kenji felt the life draining out of him, the cold creeping into his limbs, turning his blood to sludge. He didn't fight it. He let the darkness take him, a peaceful surrender after years of fighting. He had done his part. He had played the game to its bitter, inevitable conclusion. As the last of the light faded from his eyes, he heard the heavy steel door groan. It wasn't the sound of an enemy. It was the sound of someone crying. He felt hands on his shoulders, gentle, desperate. "Kenji, wake up please." It was Hannah. Her voice was broken, stripped of the cold, lethal edge she had used just hours before. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, his lungs filling with fluid. He felt something warm against his chest, a bandage being pressed against the wound. "You idiot," she sobbed. "You absolute idiot. Why didn't you just tell me? Why didn't you explain?" He opened his eyes, the world blurry and indistinct. She was there, her face tear-streaked, looking just like the sister he had tried to protect. "Hiroshi." He rasped, the name catching in his throat. "Hiroshi is gone," she whispered, her hands shaking as she worked to stop the bleeding. "He's been gone for an hour. The news? It's everywhere, Kenji. The syndicate is falling. The police are already raiding his compounds. He's running." Kenji looked at her, confusion clouding his mind. "Why?" he managed to wheeze. She looked at the monitor, at the rows of data, the exposure, the truth. "Because I didn't work for him," she said, her voice dropping. "I was playing him too. I was trying to save you from him. I wanted to kill him, not you. The realization hit Kenji with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't been the only one playing the long game. She had been the shadow within the shadow, infiltrating the enemy, pretending to be the victim, all to get close enough to strike. And he had almost killed her. He had almost ruined the entire plan because he couldn't see past his own pain. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound that turned into a coughing fit. "We're a hell of a pair," he breathed, the relief washing over him, stronger than the pain. She smiled, a weak, broken thing. "We're the only ones left." She stood up, pulling him with her, bracing his weight against her shoulder. They walked out of the bunker together, the morning air crisp and clean against their skin. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. The war was over. The empire was in ruins. And for the first time in 20 years the shadows were gone. They walked down the mountain, leaving the past behind them, the weight of it finally lifted. They didn't know what the future held or what the world would look like when they reached the bottom. They only knew that they were together. They were free. Kenji looked at his sister, at the scars she carried, and the strength she had built, and he knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, clean and sharp, and for the first time in his life he didn't feel the need to look behind him. He looked forward into the light and started to walk. If this story broke your heart and then put it back together the way it did mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories of redemption, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of family.